So this unboxing is a true story, and it's a World War II Japanese American internment story. Which, internment is kind of this term that's like a whitewashing of actually what happened. So it's really more when Japanese Americans were unfairly imprisoned. And it's by Maggie Tokuda-Hall, who's Japanese American, and illustrated by Yas Imamura. And it's the story, like you can kind of see in the background window, that they are behind barbed wire and that there's a guard tower with a gun, but they also are in a library. And it's, not a lot of books. It's like a makeshift library. And so this is the story of Tama, who works at the Minnetonka incarceration camp. So that's, it's great. They're using the word incarceration, not internment. She's been imprisoned. It's in Idaho, and the camp is relentless. And getting through each day is hard. That's a really good point, because the weather conditions are terrible and the living conditions are terrible. But in the midst of this, hardship and unfair incarceration, there's George, and this is Maggie Tokuda-Hall's grandparents' story, who met in Minnetonka during World War II. A wrenching and beautiful tale of two people who find each other during a time of extreme darkness and the family born out of their love. And this is by Candlewood Press. And here they are in the desert, where there's just like dust. It's like either too hot or too cold, and there's dust, and it gets into everything. The food, it's in your eyes. It's hard to breathe. But she has a job because she likes books. She didn't know how to be a librarian. That didn't matter. People just did whatever they could and what was needed. And also they were paid very poorly. It was like, whatever people were making, it was like in outside of imprisonment camp is probably like, 1%. It's like pennies per hour. But here's George, and he checks out a lot of books. And they had been in Minnetonka for a year already. She should have graduated college, but instead she's stuck here. And I think depending on what college you went to and what your family felt, some colleges you could go back to college instead of being in, this Japanese prison camp. But some colleges, and I'm going to reference USC, University of Southern California, they didn't allow Japanese Americans students back to their campus. They made them stay in these imprisonment camps, but other colleges did. And most families wanted their college kids to go back to college to learn, even though the college kids were like, we want to stay with you and make sure you're okay. But in Tama's case, maybe she went to USC because they suck. And yeah, she wasn't allowed to go back to college. USC recently, like in the 2020 something, gave those students their degrees finally. But I mean, most of them are no longer alive. And so here in the summer it was brutally hot, in the winter it was brutally cold, and also just the living conditions were very poor. The walls were very thin. There were holes, so the wind is coming through, the cold and the heat is coming, the dust is coming through, and people were getting sick. Children and adults and grandparents, all the generations. For these poor living conditions, the food wasn't, highly nutritious. Nobody had privacy. They did what they could, but in some prison camps, people revolted, and it was, it got violent and ugly. But I don't think Minnetonka was one of them. Anyway, she worked in the library and did what she could to make this experience, I'm sure slightly better because of her. But here was George. George was always here with his books, and Tama loves books. And George has a big crush on her. And in Minnetonka, actually, they play baseball. And I think in a lot of the camps, when the community spirit was good, I think one of them was the only one that had the revolt. Baseball was kind of a pastime that just, gave them focus and helped them get through these terrible times. So it's great that Minnetonka has this. So here is, sort of the beginning of their life story, and he's sort of like a constant in her life, and they eventually get married. And I think they're still stuck in camp. Yes, they are still imprisoned, but they do get married, and their first son is born imprisoned. So it was a miracle to be able to fall in love in this place that was just, a prison camp. And here are the guards with their guns, and if you stepped like even like a foot or a toe outside, you could be shot and killed, and that did happen. My son did a report on that, and it was a Japanese elderly man, I believe, who was just reaching out to look at a plant, like an unusual plant that was like a miracle that was growing there, and then he was shot and killed for just reaching out for this plant. And so anyway, this is a story about miracles and a love story that happened despite, and it's also sort of like a metaphor, because in these terrible conditions where it's like a desert and there's, dust storms, not only did love flourish and blossom as in the case of her grandparents, but the Japanese Americans were such good farmers that they were able to grow crops. Because that's what they did. That's what they did before they were forced into internment camp. And, there's a lot of research that shows because people knew Japanese Americans weren't dangerous, those reports were hidden because it was white farmers, particularly from the West Coast, California and Oregon, who were plotting for decades how to get rid of the Japanese Americans, who were very a severe threat to their, to white farmers, because at the time Japanese American produce was superior, and they produced, I think it was actually a staggering 40% of produce in America prior to World War II, of the highest quality, and they just couldn't compete. And so they used the racism and the opportunity to these white farming organizations out of Southern California to lobby Congress to put the Japanese Americans into these concentration camps, because then they could take over the farms, they could take over the land, especially if the land was leased. And what is factual about that is that the Japanese Americans were, quote unquote, deemed dangerous enough to have to be put in these concentration camps, and yet they were forced to farm their crops up until the point of harvest, and then they were removed and put into concentration camps, as if they were perfectly fine and forced to work for free until the crops were ready to be harvested, which was then harvested by the white farmers, who then took over, sold the crops, made the money, bought the equipment, pennies on the dollar. And so I think a lot of times when you see things about racism and war and terrible things happening to people, always follow the money. Who benefits from it? Because if you follow the money, you can see it isn't just racism, but it's, somebody's going to financially benefit from this. And, in this case, and also with African Americans who were forced off their land or their towns were burned down, it's always like conveniently after the crops get harvested, and the white people who have chased the people off financially gain from, getting these crops for free that they can sell and the land for free. So anyway, that is my 2 cents. My son did his junior high school thesis on this topic, and his history teacher, AP US History, no less, at first said that his theory about the Japanese American farmers being forced into prison camps was a quote unquote conspiracy theory. And yet my son persevered and wrote his paper and got a kind of decent grade, but frankly, I think he was robbed. And so it was just astounding to me that, a history teacher would think this is a conspiracy theory. But, that's about history. It's not, it's not just stories, but like economics. Follow the money.